The Pipers of Mallory by Theo Douglas. Read by Miss Worm. Chapter 1. While my last letter was flying out to you in India, dear Margaret, and your reply flying back to me, a great deal has been happening. My last letter was all about Jack, wasn't it? How we met and fell in love, and how he was under orders for the war, and so we had to be married in a desperate hurry. Such a hurry that it shocked Aunt Winifred, glad as she was to get rid of me. I told you what I was going to wear, and Jack says I made a rather nice-looking bride. Well, he put it more strongly than that. He was, of course, in khaki, and looked dearer than ever, and half an hour or less turned me into Mrs. Fraser. We had only 9 days of our honeymoon, instead of the 3 weeks we hoped for, but they were 9 lovely days. Then there was the dreadful going away. But before that came about, the question had to be settled. The question you ask, my dear. What was to become of me while Jack was away in France, fighting those horrible Huns? It was over this Jack and I had our first difference. Not a serious difference, for we kissed and made it up at once, when I found out what he wanted me to do. He actually wished me to make my home with his mother in Scotland. Fancy that! To bury myself for months and months in the wilds with a woman I did not know, who would be worse than Aunt Winifred twice over. I had never been free in my life, but always in leading strings, and I made up my mind I would be free now, quite on my own, to make up for what I should suffer through Jack being away. I didn't tell Jack that, about wanting to be emancipated. He wouldn't have understood. I told him what was quite true, that I wanted to make my volunteer training of use, and do war work of sorts in a London hospital, like Violet Power. And my plan was that Violet and I should take a flat together, a tiny flat which would cost next to nothing, I thought, near enough to her hospital to be convenient, a hospital which needed helpers, and would find work for me, too. Jack did not like it, dear fellow. He's one of the old-fashioned sort who thinks women should be hedged about and protected, and give themselves up to looking after their household concerns. But he gave in when he saw I was determined. That was nearly at the end of our time together, our lovely time. He had planned to take me up to Mallalerie to say goodbye at the end of his leave, but having to go off suddenly altered that. However, he made me promise I would go there alone as soon as he left, to pay my mother-in-law a long visit before I settled down with Violet in the flat. Over that I was obliged to yield, with some private reservation about the long, for, as you will understand, I could not say no to him just then. We parted, and it was a hard parting. He put me in the night train for the north before he left to cross over to France. Peters, his mother's servant, was to meet me in Edinburgh and take care of me from there. You see, I could not get away from the take care. Now, you will know from my letter, the Jack letter, that I'd never seen Lady Heron. She is always more or less of an invalid, and bronchitis, or something like that, prevented her taking the long journey to be present at our wedding. Fancy having attacks of bronchitis, and yet living up there in the north. She's been a widow for many years, and Jack is her only son. Well, there is a son by a former marriage, Jack's half-brother, who is now Lord Heron. The Frasers are very poor these days, but Jack's mother has an income of her own, well, I don't think it's a large one. Mallalerie is the old family place. Mind you pronounce it right, Mallalerie, and not the other way. I suppose Lady Heron wouldn't live there if Heron married, but he's still a bachelor, and with the regiment somewhere in France. Jack does not say much about his half-brother. I fancy the two are not very good friends. Peters was waiting for me on the Edinburgh station, and by that time I was feeling rather better and able to take an interest in what was new. Breakfast was ready for me at a hotel, with no bill for it, as Peters paid for everything. I was her ladyship's guest, he said, and it was by Lady Heron's orders. He seemed quite hurt when I offered. A very good breakfast it was, and I was hungry, for I had been far too wretched to eat any dinner the night before. Then, after rest and refreshment, I had to sally forth again to a different station, Peters carrying my hand luggage. And when we gained the street, that wonderful street with the castle opposite, standing up grey against the morning sky, there was a skirl of wild music coming towards us, with the tramp of marching feet. A skirl, that is the right word for bagpipes, as perhaps you know. I dare say you've heard them in India, as there are Scottish regiments there, but I had never heard them before. Their music may be barbaric, and people say so, but there is something about it that fires the blood, that fired my blood, though I am only a Scotswoman married and not born. I could understand how it put spirit into the tired feet which were following, muddy from a long route march, as they kept time to the swing and beat of the brave tune. Jack belongs to a Highland regiment, of course, the same that Heron is in, and at that moment I felt prouder than ever to be Jack's wife. I suppose Lady Heron has a piper at Mallalerie, has she not? It was the first question I had put to Peters. I had the notion that a piper must be a necessary appendage to every Highland family of importance. Lady Heron would not, of course, detain a young man, but she might so employ some old retainer, past the age to be of service in the war. But the servant shook his head. He, too, is quite elderly, did I say, and speaks broad Scotch, though his name might as well be English. No, mum, he answered. We've no piper at Mallalerie. Her ladyship does not like the pipes. Not like the pipes? How odd of her, I thought. And upon this scrap of information, the latent opposition which I had felt towards Jack's mother from the beginning swelled and took shape. How strange of a woman who had soldier sons, a son and a stepson, and who wrote as if she were proud of them and their calling, and of one who I knew from Jack was Highland bred to the backbone. Throughout the journey northwest, now with great hills looming up through the mist, now by the side of rushing streams, I was thinking of my mother-in-law, and how much easier it would have been to meet her for the first time if Jack had gone with me to Mallalerie. I was afraid of her, to tell the truth, and that made me brace myself beforehand to be defiant, picturing a great lady who would stand on her dignity and think Jack might have done better for himself than in marrying me, an Englishwoman of no particular family and small fortune. She would condemn, she would dictate, she would want to interfere. The day wore on, for the train was not a fast one, and there were frequent stoppages. And every hour Peters would come to the window to know whether I wanted anything. But at last there came the station, where we alighted for Mallalerie. There was a car to meet us, and in less than half an hour, Mallalerie came into view. Not the fine place I had been picturing to myself, only a moderate-sized country house, but possessing a tower with corner turrets in the Scottish fashion, which gives it some distinction. The rest of the house is low, with thick walls of undoubted antiquity. The windows are small, but beyond them are lovely views. It was only a confused impression I derived from that first entrance, of a hall warm with firelight, decorated with heads of beasts and skins and weapons, of a room beyond, also warm, and of a frail little lady rising from her chair at the window and coming lamely across to greet me with an embrace and a kiss. Such a frail little lady to be the mother of a great strong man like Jack. She, like the house, was not what I expected, but I was right in two particulars. She is grande dame to the fingertips, and I am certain she views me critically. Chapter 2. On further acquaintance, I like Lady Heron better than I expected, and I have been able to express myself somewhat enthusiastically in writing to Jack. This will please him. I would give a good deal to know what her letter, the long letter I saw her writing, said to him about me. She is kind to me, painstakingly kind, but still we are strangers to each other, and I think it likely we shall be strangers to the end. That she is fond of Jack ought to knit a bond between us, but somehow I strongly suspect it is the very thing which holds us apart. She is always testing and appraising me, though not in the way I expected. She tells me little anecdotes of Jack's youth, and watches to see if I receive them with the enthusiasm I ought. She shows me some cherished pictures, stupid, old-fashioned photographs, of Jack as a baby, Jack as a toddler learning to walk, and upwards at various stages of his boyhood. It is plainly my duty to care about these, but I don't particularly. They seem too far removed from the Jack I know. The pictures bore me, and I shudder inwardly when a new anecdote is presented. And sitting here, in the chair of truth, I must confess it, I find Mallalerie dull. My chief amusement is going out for rambles by myself. Rambles Lady Heron is too lame to share. She can only walk up and down the terrace with her stick by way of exercise, and that at the sunniest time of the day. The surroundings here are certainly beautiful, and the Highland people interest me. I talk to them when I have a chance, and try to get accustomed to their way of speech. It was from one of these Highlanders I found out the reason why Lady Heron does not like the pipes. I never put the question to her. I do not know why not, as it would have been a simple thing to ask, but whenever it came into my head, something happened to divert the thought and keep the words unspoken. But that thrilling pibroch heard in Edinburgh seemed to haunt me here at Mallalerie, though not always the same tune. I dreamt of it the first night I was here. It waked me from sleep, as a real thing might have done. But when I listened in the deep country stillness and the darkness of the unfamiliar room, there was not a sound. And each time I walked in the direction of Glen Fruin, I heard it with my waking ears, very faint and far in the distance, but I could be certain it was there. I went some way up the glen on the third occasion, hoping to get nearer to the sound, but it seemed to recede as I approached. The preliminary skirl and 2 or 3 bars of a tune, as if the musician were practising, and then a halt and silence. Presently my watch warned me I should return, for Mallalerie is a punctual household, and Lady Heron would be waiting for tea. I was well on my way home when I met an old shepherd I had spoken to before, and as I still heard the music at intervals, I bethought myself to ask him, "Who is it about here who plays the pipes? Somebody is practising away there in the glen." Highland fashion, he met my question by another, and his shaggy brows drew together. "You be the Lady Fraser, be you not?" "I was Mrs. Fraser," I told him. "Aye, well, you're Fraser married, and so have a right to hear. 'Tisn't lucky for the Frasers when the pipes are sounding in Glenfruin, but the Lord be thanked that they don't come lower down. I do not like to hear 'em myself, being nobbut Steenson that was once MacGregor." That was pretty well Greek to me. "Why isn't it good for the Frasers?" I demanded. "You never heard the legend? Maybe 'tis not for the likes of me to tell you, but seeing as ye ask, time gone by, the chief of the Frasers had his pipers equal with the best. Always 7 of them in his tail, and gallants growing up to take the place, and a proud place it was, of them as were short-winded or old. Glenfruin was full of folk then, where there's nowt now but a wheen ruins, or a square in the green to mark where walls have been. And custom was that Fraser's pipers should be chosen from the Glenfruin folk. That was a time of great battles, same as now, and the Frasers were up in arms. I don't mind the name of the battle, no, nor how long ago, but there was a great slaughter, and the Frasers fell to a man, and the pipers with their chief. It is said there was none to fill their places, for the callants had not been instructed, and the head of the clan was nobbut a wailing bairn. And since that day the Frasers have had no pipers, the Frasers of Mallory. Maybe that is why the dead men are not content. And when a Fraser is about to die, they are heard piping in Glenfruin. I am putting down the old man's words as nearly as I remember them, but I dare say I spell them wrong. As I listened, a cold shiver went down my spine and crept along the roots of my hair. If my hair had been undone, I think it would have stood up with fright. "Why, you don't mean to say," I stammered, "you don't mean to tell me that what I've been hearing is a ghost in broad daylight and in the open air? And who is it? Who is going to die?" "You needn't be afeard, my lady, for him as is your own. There's a many Frasers at the war besides, and the pipers pipe the same for a death in bed. There's John Fraser near his end at the mill, and maybe 'tis for him. He has a son fighting, and Donald Fraser, farmer, has 2 more. You needna fear for the heads of the clan, nor for their womenfolk, unless the pipers come right down to Mallalerie and go round the house." "Do they come as close as that?" I asked, shuddering. "Aye, my lady, that they do, and they're heard by all of the Fraser name, and sometimes by them as are not so called, but I never heard tell of their being seen. It's just a sound, and no more. Sometimes a lament on the pipes, sometimes a fine march for them as fall. And they go round once for a woman, and twice for the heir, and 3 times for the head of the clan. They went 3 times around the house when the late lord died, and there was many who heard them, together with my Lady Heron herself, and ever since then she hasna been able to bear the pipes, the real pipes, and they're warned not to come nigh. After that, I wondered no more at what Peters had told me in Edinburgh. The faint, far-off skirling, which had sounded even while old Steenson was speaking, ceased as I hurried back. But Mallalerie looked a dark blot in the prospect, dismal as it had never seemed before. Was it because of this superstition that Lady Heron had grown old and grey before her time? It would be awful, I thought, to live here year in and year out, eternally listening for those notes of doom. What should I do, I, a married Fraser, if I heard them circling round the house, and if it meant that Jack... I tell you frankly what was my first impression afterwards. Some healthy scepticism came to my relief. An old man's story of impossible ghosts. Where was the need to credit it? Through that day and the next, everything moved on velvet. The quiet, regular hours, the careful service, the slightly formal ways with an old-world atmosphere about them, which I found piquant and attractive when not in one of my impatient moods. And I was perhaps more patient, more inclined to be appreciative, because the weeks of my visit had nearly run out. Very soon now I should be setting out to establish myself with Violet at the flat, in the midst of London and life. I was softened too, because Lady Heron appeared to recognise my right of choice as to what I would do in Jack's absence. All she said was, "Your home is here, my dear, when you care to have it so. When you wish to come back to Mallalerie, you have only to let me know." Then I heard her sigh softly to herself, perhaps because she recognised that I did not care. I thanked her and said I would write, and she replied, "I think I shall know without telling." An odd thing to say. On the next evening, which was the last but one, we were sitting together in the half-light with the windows open, for although it was late October, the weather was still warm. I was holding wool for Lady Heron to wind, and was so close in front of her and could clearly see her face, when in the distance, and a mere thread of sound, but perfectly distinct, I heard the skirl of the pipes. I do not think my hands trembled, held out stiffly with the skein, but hers did in the effort to wind. The thin, faint music came near, nearer, and then seemed to turn away, not to the house. For all my cherished unbelief, I was thankful that it was not coming to the house. Lady Heron had dropped her ball of wool, and now stooped to regain it. "We will not wind any more now, my dear," she said. "I am obliged to you, but I shall have enough." And then she crossed the room and rang the bell. A hanging bell-pull, old-fashioned, like all else at Mallalerie. Peters came quickly, was it only my fancy that he looked disturbed? We shall have the windows closed now, and the lamp lit. Such was her commonplace order. I heard no more of the pipes that night, but the next morning came the news that John Fraser, the tenant of the mill, had passed away. It was, no doubt, a coincidence, nothing more, but we may put it down as an odd one. That was the day before yesterday. I left early yesterday morning, Peters going with me as far as Edinburgh, and I have been busy writing all these hours in the train. What a packet you'll have to wade through. Chapter 3. Oh, you have been good, dear Margaret, in liking my letters about the hospital work, although while I was so busy they could only be scraps. And what was worse, I'm afraid my letters to poor old Jack in the trenches were scrappy too. Ungrateful, perhaps, for I have lived all this while on his scraps to me. But to go back to the hospital, you will be surprised to hear that I've had to give up my work there, which is a great disappointment. But everything has been horrid of late. I'm alone in the flat. The beginning of the upset was that Violet turned horrid. Wasn't it nasty of her when we had been such chums? I told you about Captain Bridgewater, who used to come to see us after he left the hospital. Well, he was cousin to some of Violet's people, and an old schoolfellow's of Jack's. It seemed right and natural to be friends. As that was so, I liked him in the beginning. Really, I liked him very much, and was pleased when he showed that he liked me. But Violet liked him in a different way, and expected a flirtation they had begun years before to have a serious meaning. She declares it would have meant something serious if it had not been for me. So we had a quarrel, and she said dreadful things, and I was indignant, as I had a right to be, and was not sorry when she packed her boxes and gave up her share of the flat, leaving me alone. I was not sorry, but I was shaken by it, and it so happened that when Captain Bridgewater came in, he found me crying. Well, then he was horrid too, and said things that at first I did not understand, and that he had no business to say to Jack's wife, he who had been Jack's friend. I shall never speak to him again, you may be sure. After this, I went to the hospital, to my work as usual, but I did not feel a bit like myself. I had a fainting fit for the first time in my life, and they were a long while in bringing me to. Afterwards, the doctor told me I should have to give up volunteering, as I am not strong enough. I'm wondering what I ought to do. Jack would not like me being here by myself. We only consented to the plan because Violet was joining me, and I do not know of anybody else. But nothing on earth will induce me to go back to Aunt Winifred. I was interrupted there, and now where do you think I am continuing my letter? I'm writing in the train, the Scotch Express, and I'm on my way to Mallalerie. There's a surprise for you, and a surprise for me, but I begin to think it is the best solution of the difficulty that could be found. Lady Heron sent for me, and the queer thing is how she could have known or guessed. I begin to think my mother-in-law must be a bit of a witch. Where I broke off above was when the servant came in to say a man named Peters had called and brought a letter. It was a kind letter, so kind a letter that it made me cry, though that is saying little, as tears have been close to my eyes of late. The rigours of winter were past, Lady Heron wrote. The days were already lengthening into spring. A visit would give her the utmost pleasure, and she fancied it might now suit me to come to her again. Peters was her messenger instead of the post, and if I were willing, Peters would arrange my journey and spare me all trouble about it, as indeed he has done. And it was not necessary for me to write. Peters would send her a wire, and a warm welcome would await me. So here I am, travelling north. And I think you will agree it has been a wise decision, and one that will please Jack as things are. I shall post this to you in Edinburgh, my dear, and write again from Mallalerie. Chapter 4. Really, Margaret, I am happy to be here, much happier than I was before. Lady Heron is so kind, and I think we understand each other better than we did. I have a lovely room on the south side of the house, and the air is far milder than you would suppose. We never say anything about the pipes, but I fancy they must have been heard twice at least while I was in London, because 2 more of the Frasers have fallen, sons of the people at the farm, and another of the clan name died in hospital the week before my return. Alas, we have heard the pipes again, and I will tell you how. They came at the edge of dusk, not what they call here the murk of the night, but while there was still light enough to see, had there been bodily presence to be seen. Lady Heron likes me to play to her, and I was sitting at the piano recollecting old airs, and sometimes crooning a bit of song half to myself, when it seemed as if my music had an echo outside the house. My fingers fell from the keys, and in another moment I was sure what it was, and where. It came with a sweep, swiftly, devouring space, heard afar, and then immediately close, passing our window which looked out upon nothing. Nothing, not a shadow even, nor the print of a foot. The wild pibroch passed by, but it went circling round the house, and oh, it was coming back. We both sprang up and met in a close clasp together, each of us calling the other by name. "Mother," I cried to her, the first time I have called her so, but it seemed rent from me without thought. It passed the second time, and now there was a cry with it, like a human voice in pain, and again it went circling through the air which had been still, but was rising with a gust of storm. Twice for the air. That was what the old man Steenson had said. And oh me, Jack was the air. There was a pause of seconds, and then it passed for the third time, the pibroch and the shriek. Afterwards there was a great silence. The wind which had swept with it fell also, if it were wind indeed, and we 2 women drew apart and looked at each other. Her face was ghastly, and I expect mine was no better. "Cecily," she said, "you know." And then, "Who told you?" Soon afterwards, Peters came in to light the lamps, and the old servant's hands so trembled as he performed his task that the glasses clashed and clattered, he who was usually noiseless. He, too, had heard. Of that I made no doubt. He had heard, even as we. It was the sign for the head of the house. Lady Heron heard it just so before her husband died. There was some small comfort to us both in the belief that it came for Heron and not Jack. But that comfort did not last. The telegram from the War Office came 2 days after. Wounded and missing. Believed killed. The intimation to Lady Heron about both her sons, Lieutenant Colonel Lord Heron and Captain the Honourable John Fraser. Not one alone, but both. I cannot write about that time. A chink was left to us through which hope came, but one could hardly look at it in the face of the awful doubt. And the sign for the head of the house would stand also for Jack, provided Heron had been the first to fall. Chapter 5. Looking back, I cannot think how we endured the suspense. Counted by days, the measure of it was not long, but it seemed as if ages went by. We tried to comfort each other. Lady Heron was an angel to me through all her own pain. But for her, I would have died. I cannot write about it. You must take it for granted, and I hurry on to the end. We were sitting together, we two alone, as we were when the sign came. Lady Heron was knitting, feverishly knitting up those socks for Jack which she would not lay aside, little as either of us believed they would be worn. We were together, as I said, when Peters rushed into the room with another telegram on his silver tray. I wonder he remembered the tray. Lady Heron tore it open. It was addressed to her. Home slightly wounded. With you and Cecily tomorrow. Jack. My mind takes a leap from that moment to another, when he stood at the door. Lady Heron would not let me go to the station because I'd fainted again, and as I might not, she would not either. She said it would be unfair to take the advantage. Jack at the door, a figure in soiled khaki, very pale, with his head bandaged and his arm in a sling. Jack himself, alive and still to live. My Jack. And I do not mind now, as I once did, that he is his mother's Jack as well. He has been through dreadful things. Heron fell, poor Heron, and was left in no man's land, and Jack went after him. At the utmost risk to himself, he dragged out his brother from under a pile of dead and into the shelter of a shell crater. There they existed for 3 days under incessant fire, all hope of them being abandoned. Existed by a miracle, for it was death to move. Heron was fearfully wounded, but Jack, wounded himself, managed to bandage him so that the bleeding stopped, and then he found some emergency rations on which they sustained life. If there ever were a coldness between the brothers, as I thought, it must have melted away in those dreadful hours. On the 4th day, our troops attacked again on the farther side of the wood, which diverted attention, and then Jack began the task, the difficult and painful task, of half carrying, half dragging Heron to where he could be helped, as his only chance of life. All this time, Jack was wounded himself, in the head and on the shoulder and side. But the burst of shrapnel which shattered his arm did not happen till they were close to our own lines. By this, Heron was wounded again, but in any case Jack thinks he could not have survived. The doctor at the dressing station said so. Heron died there, but not till some hours later, and Jack was with him to the last. So the Pipers were right, and not wrong, when they bewailed the head of the house who had fallen. What it meant to Jack I did not consider then, and it came on me with a shock of surprise when Peters, some time later, addressed him as my lord. But I think more, much more, of the fact that he has been recommended for the cross.